Research from all over the world, as well as around the United States. We include PhD and faculty. We include faculty and PhD students from our Department of Interpretation, and we try to bring lectures from different topics within the field. Our goal is to emphasize key research in the interpreting field in order to stimulate discussion, or research that's taking place in other fields that might have a bearing on interpretation. This year, the Department of Interpretation has 2 silver-level sponsors, lecturers from other departments and different events, and we want to thank both of those. The first is Dr. Betsy Winston, and with time, and then Deaf Access Solutions, which is abbreviated as DAS, or DAS. They've both supported the Department of Interpretation this year, and I would like to thank them both. We always have many honored guests who arrive, and there are some that I'd like to recognize today. I'd like to welcome 2 visitors from Sweden. I'm not entirely sure how they're pronounced, but hopefully I've spelled them correctly. The first is Kristen Ångnemyr, and the second is Cecilia Anfelt. So thank you. It's a pleasure to have you join us today. Welcome to Gallaudet. Also this year we have visiting researchers. We have one from Italy by the name of Dr. Giulia Petita. And I wanted to welcome Dr. Petita here as well. I wanted to make sure before we forget that we discuss the next lecture that's going to take place on April 17th. The lecturer that day is going to be one of our own faculty members by the name of Danny Hunt. So hopefully you will be able to join us on April 17th as well. And perhaps most important for this lecture, I want to thank the interpreters. So thank you to both Adam Bartley and Valerie Sultan. Thank you both. Next, I would like to introduce the director of the GURIEC, Beverly Hallra. Hello to everyone in the room. Welcome to all of you. I would like to begin by talking a bit about the GURIEC. We receive federal funding from the Department of Education, and that funding allows us to sponsor events such as this one. We are thrilled to be able to do so. We always look forward to these events and to this exciting research, this evidence-based research that we're able to present to you today and during our other lectures. Throughout this series, you will see a great deal of work that's taken place and a lot of energy, including the presentation by Dr. Smith today. And Dr. Nicodemus has put forth a great deal of effort to make sure that this lecture series was successful. We also had the TV studio who's involved to make sure that these events can actually take place. But I think that most of the work has been done by Hillary Mayhew, the GURIEC coordinator, and I would like to introduce her right now. Hello.
Hello, everyone. A bit of a surprise there. Nice to see you all.
She's done a great deal of work to ensure that all of the registration was set up, that the CEU process was taking place. So a great deal of thanks to her. We have almost 700 people who are viewing the lecture today. Many are in the room, but many more are throughout the United States. We have ASL students in Georgia. We have deaf students in North Carolina. We have interpreters from California, Kansas, Wisconsin, Virginia, North Carolina. We have interpreter education programs in Ohio, Wisconsin, Texas, Florida. And we also have individuals from other countries, from Australia to Brazil, who are all joining us today via streaming. And we're thrilled to have all of them join us. So thank you for being able to do so. I'd like to share some details or some logistics that I need to explain. The first is, for those of you who are viewing online in groups, please do make sure that you register individually, not as a group. You're able to do that now. Let me show you the link.
Actually, it's not showing on the screen.
Oh, apparently it's not showing on the screen.
It's actually at the top of the screen.
Okay, so it's on your screen, up at the top of your screen, apparently. I can't see it, but those of you who are online are able to see it, if you look to the top of your screen. Also, please do check your email, because the PowerPoints will be available. Hillary sent that email this morning, so you should have that available. That way you're able to follow along with the PowerPoints. And the link should be on the top of your screen as well. Oh, we don't have a slide for that. For some reason, their slides are not working. Here, we're having some technical difficulties. I apologize. But please do check your email. You should have the slides available there. If you know of some individuals who have yet to register but would like to, please tell them that they're welcome to do so. Registration is still open. If you do register, you must take the pre-test before the lecture, and then when the lecture is completed, you must also do the post-test and the post-assessment. The deadline is March 15th. And we need that information for our grant. We receive money from the federal government, and you know that the government is quite stringent about ensuring that they have evidence that the program has been effective and that people are actually learning from the program. So that's why we have the pre and the post assessments. That allows us to provide that evidence to the government in order to ensure that we get more funding for future events. With respect to CEUs, those of you who are actually in the room watching the lecture, you will be able to collect, or you will be able to gather your CEUs through GURIEC. Those of you who are online, you must contact your local support agency. Obviously, we can't do that for 700 people throughout the United States, and then also Australia and Brazil. Well, maybe not Australia and Brazil, but that wouldn't matter anyway. If you do not know who your local sponsor is, please check our website. We have the names listed there, and you can select from there different agencies who would be willing to sponsor your CEUs. And we are grateful to those agencies who are willing to sponsor CEUs. Again, please do remember to do the post-assessment after the presentation is done. Thank you very much. Welcome. My name is Dr. Brenda Nicodemus. I'm here to introduce Dr. Melissa Smith. First, I would like to say that I was thinking about the comment regarding 700 people who are joining us to watch this lecture, and that doesn't surprise me at all, because I think this particular topic strikes interpreters for the deaf community, interpreters for deaf children, and the deaf community itself at the heart. Since 1975, there was Public Law 94-142 that provided deaf children the right to have access to their public schools and to get education in their local area, And that had a very powerful impact on the sign language interpreting field. So for many years, we were trying to determine the best way to provide services for those deaf children in a variety of situations. And we were trying to do so with limited evidence, limited research to support doing so. I would like to, fortunately, Dr. Smith's work has broken through that barrier and has provided us better understanding about how to provide interpreting services in the classroom for deaf children, and we're very grateful to her for that. Dr. Smith is a professor and also a director of the ASL English Interpreting Program in Palomar College, which is in San Diego, California, where it's nice and warm, not the way that it is here. Her Ed.D. she got from the University of California in San Diego in the field of teaching and learning. The book about this topic that she wrote was published by Gallaudet Press, and she'll talk more about that. She has a very rich background that provides her a different number of perspectives regarding this topic. She is a second language learner. She is an interpreter. She is an interpreter educator. So she's had all of these different roles leading to a variety of experiences, giving her different perspectives on this. And perhaps you don't know, but she is also a mother of a deaf teenager. And I think that has also provided her a different perspective on this topic. So we're excited about her coming here today and sharing her work, talking about what interpreters do in the classroom. Thank you very much. Welcome, Dr. Melissa Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank all of you here. Thank you, Dr. Nicodemus, for the beautiful introduction. I am thrilled to be here today. It is a great honor. I have done work and research on the area of interpreters in schools and education, and Dr. Nicodemus, as you mentioned, here at Gallaudet University Press, has published my work, that research, as a book. And my presentation today will attempt to survey some of that research and its findings. I hope to be able to provide you some additional thoughts and considerations about what the implications of that research are for our field. And I'm delighted to see the room full of guests here. And I can handle the cold. I'm coming from San Diego, California, so cold for us means, 30 degrees. Anything around there, if we got a snow date, if it's just below 30, but it never happens at any rate. Last night, as I was flying in and skimmering up to the tarmac there, we skimmed on some ice, and we were all just excited by it. What fun, what an adventure. I was a little nervous, but nonetheless. Okay. I'd like to thank all of you here at Gallaudet University, at GURIEC, and at CAITR for inviting me here today. The book, as I mentioned, is based on my research. And for that work, I also have to extend my thanks to the University of California faculty who supported, guided, and led me through this work. And it was a large undertaking, and one I learned a great deal from. I do have to mention that you don't have this slide, this particular slide in my presentation practice. I found that I hadn't mentioned the foundation of this work in the prior work. And so somehow that slide got deleted. I've entered it back into the slides for today, but I'd like to make sure that all of you viewing at home can somehow have this amended so that you have access to this. The research is now at an exciting time where prior findings have led to an expansive growth and spread of findings, some of which have heavily influenced my work. We know that interpreters are involved in a number of interactions. Dr. Melanie Metzger spoke to that, and their work has been influential in providing evidence that interpreters are not merely neutral, but have an impact on the interaction itself. Dr. Cynthia Roy was also in that research, working on that research. A great deal of work has been done on interpreters in K through 12 settings in the educational system, and has shown that they are not adept enough to do this work. Dr. Kurtz has shown that over 90% of our work, in the interpreting work in the United States schools, correction, over 50% of those working in the schools are not appropriately qualified, which is a crisis. Dr. Kurz has stated that this is a state of emergency. These interpreters should not be working with deaf and hard of hearing youth in the schools. That is one major change that needs to be seen. And additional research has shown that if you are not qualified to be interpreting in that setting, then the results are going to bear that out. The deaf children in those settings are going to be at a great loss. We absolutely must change our current systems. And increasingly, more states are enacting legislation and education policies that require greater qualifications for those interpreters. But the state of affairs is largely still lagging. We'll discuss that more as we go along. In addition, the role of the interpreter has to be questioned. A great deal of research, Dr. Ben Jones has found in their research that the roles of interpreters and others in these settings, and Dr. Antia has also done some research examining the roles of interpreters, and this is critical for our discussion and discourse. Dr. Bethany Winston, one of the sponsors of today's presentation, is also under the team project found in their research on the classroom environment itself. They were able to identify different barriers to true access to the education that was supposed to be provided in that environment as it went through interpreters. For me, the idea of how we as interpreters make decisions in these processes is critical. Dean and Pollard's work has been influential in our field, examining how we analyze the various goings-on in the interpreted environment and how we understand and analyze the choices that we have, the decisions that we make, and how we make them. This has heavily influenced my own thinking about the work that we do. In examining how we make decisions on the work that we do, I have found that there's certainly not enough evidence on which to base many of those decisions. We want to look at not merely the interpreter themselves, but also what the interpreter's work looks like, what it is in whole, to better understand how we can make specific arguments about the particular roles or mixing of roles that interpreters might take on in these settings. Many of my students have avidly sought out more information on this, and some interpreters substituting in schools are faced with similar conundrums. Professional organizations for interpreters are hotly debating these topics and coming from entrenched views on either side. And so this begs further examination into what exactly is happening that is causing so much dissent and discussion. My research question was twofold. First, questioning what it is that interpreters are doing. And secondly, examining what the influences are on their decision-making processes. As an interpreter educator, I find that many students upon graduation enter as a first job the area of K through 12 schooling. And I certainly want to know how I can better prepare those students to enter into that workforce. That is one of my driving influences as an interpreter educator. And to that end, I established a data collection process that included interviews with a number of interpreters individually and as a group to find what common themes emerged from that. I worked with 3 different schools around the state of California, engaged in videotaping those interpreters' work, their live work in the classroom, which was very advantageous. I selected 5th and 6th grade settings, which were certainly fun settings, and very interesting in that they had very young kids, some of whom were very new to the mainstream experience, some who had not been involved in the signing world. Some of these deaf and hard of hearing students who have used interpreters for access to education and have had a great deal of experience in that, in getting that educational experience through sign language. Some of them were very new to the mainstream setting, some old hands at it. I examined 3 interpreters who were working with 4 different students in these schools. I was able to videotape in the classroom both the students themselves, who were using assistive technologies such as amplification and handheld mics that the teachers use with FM loops, as well as the use of signed language interpreting for support. One student comes from a family that doesn't sign and speak for themselves, and the language of the home, in fact, is Spanish. But while at school, this student, at another school, there was a deaf student who'd come from a residential school, as opposed to the first student who'd been mainstreamed their whole life. At this other school, the 6th grade student had been, prior to this, at a school for the deaf, and then a self-contained deaf classroom, and then a mainstreamed classroom. That particular student came from a family who had some moderate ability to sign. At the 3rd school, there were 2 deaf students who were in the same classroom, one of whom was a deaf student who spoke for themselves but also signed fluently, came from a family where both parents were deaf. The mother was a user of cochlear implants and a signer, and the father also a signer. The other student in that classroom was new to the mainstream system and was new to mainstreaming all day long, with the exception of writing and language arts. And the language of the family at home was Spanish with no use of sign. So this gives you a broad idea of the deaf and hard of hearing students that were engaged in this study. It's also important that I describe what I mean by video elicitation interviews. After entering into the classroom and videotaping the live work of those interpreters, I then was able to edit it and interview the interpreter whose work was videotaped. They were able to watch the work and describe the decision-making processes in their own words that they engaged in that exchange. And then we could look at where those processes aligned with the thoughts that they had about their decision-making processes, which allowed for multiple takes on the same event. We were able to watch the video itself to examine it for further findings. As I mentioned, I want to examine interpreters who have already met the minimum qualification standards. And ironic when we haven't yet really established those standards. But I want to ensure that those reading my study have some idea of what the level of qualifications of each of the interpreters involved in this study are. To that end, I have the demographics listed in this table. And I've used pseudonyms for each of the interpreters. AJ was the most experienced of those three, was a native signer who also held an advanced degree in the field of education, was a certified interpreter at the national level, certified by the RID, Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, with 26 years of experience, highly qualified. Cami, the second interpreter, holds an EIPA, Educational Interpreter Performance Assessment rating of 4.2. The EIPA is an instrument that runs on a 5-point scale. And the test developers have stated that a 3.5 rating indicates that the interpreter will certainly miss a great deal of information. To me, that begs the question of how we can accept that much loss of information and just say, okay, cool, that's good enough. Sadly, but truly, many states only require a minimum of 3.5. Some states only requiring 3.0. And as we mentioned, 50% of interpreters have not met even this minimal standard, which is indeed a crisis. It's a crisis that begs the attention of all of us. Who is watching this? It is time to call for a change. It is time for a change. Okay. Only 10 states currently require an EIPA of 4.0 or above. During the time in which I was collecting data, California required, and in fact I should say that we went through the process of establishing definitions to more clearly spell out the requirements for K through 12 during this time. And we're just beginning to recognize that those in the workforce are not qualified at present. And so they have established a phasing system so that over it's a process of several years, beginning in 2007, those interpreters that are working in K through 12 settings had to have a 3.0, and then in 2007 they began to require a 3.5. In 2008, a 4.0, so a three-phased system. So I am indeed happy that California is now requiring a minimal rating of 4.0, but at the time of my research collection of data, they weren't yet requiring that standard. And so the third interpreter that I examined at that time met California's minimum qualification standard, but that was not at the current standard. It was not the new standard. And they would not meet that standard. And I'll speak more to that as we go along.
You may be wondering what the ESSE stands for. California has another assessment, another test that they provide to interpreters. It's called the Education Signing Skills Evaluation. So California recognizes a 4.0 on that particular assessment as well, so it's similar to the EIPA system. The interpreter, the third interpreter, had a bachelor's degree in interpreting and had 8 months of experience, so far less experience. Cami, the second interpreter, had a 4.2 on the EIPA, plus had training related to K through 12 interpreting, an associate's degree. So you'll see that they each had different educational backgrounds. What I found was that what interpreters do is really fivefold. There are 5 primary tasks that they take on. And I'll talk about each of those briefly because I feel that the content of my work is actually not in those 5. I mean, those 5 are key, but I think that it becomes more interesting as we get deeper into the discussion. Surprise! Right? Interpreters actually interpret and transliterate. For those of you who don't know, transliteration refers to signing that follows more English word order, so an English-based syntax. For now, that definition is going to have to suffice. Now, interestingly, many schools require interpreters to either interpret, or well, some require transliteration. So some of them have a policy within the school that requires transliteration. But I found that sometimes interpreters would go back and forth between interpreting and transliteration for meaning purposes, for purposeful reasons. They would deem that a particular situation required one or the other, or perhaps even both. Both would often occur. And I think it's important to document this because the language policy that's in practice is not wise. If we require someone to sign in a particular way, but it doesn't meet that child's needs in that moment, in that situation, it doesn't meet the teacher's goals, then it's not valuable to anybody in the room. If we're trying to give them the English exposure but not interpret the meaning, then that's not, it's not beneficial for the child. So we need to consider language policy and discuss some of the specifics related to that. And it's not just about the classroom, it's not just about the lesson, it's not just about the deaf and hard of hearing student themselves. The same interpreter will go back and forth between interpreting and transliteration for different reasons. Interpreters have to look for and take advantage of different resources that are available to them, whether they're physical resources, human resources, mental resources. So they're trying to avail themselves of these different resources, and they have to be quite creative sometimes as well. So again, this goes back to the question of roles, which is the issue that's been up for debate. We have to start looking at what is needed in a particular situation and what skills the interpreter or the staff who are working with the deaf and hard of hearing students are needed. Some people will say, well, that's not your role, and then there's all of this discussion that occurs. But we need to be more clear about what is appropriate, when it's appropriate, and why it's appropriate. I need a better word for this. Oh, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. The fourth primary task for interpreters is interaction with several different types of individuals for several different reasons. If you want to see more about who and what type of interaction occurs, please read my book. Some of you are working in the field and you already know that you interact with different people throughout the day. And yes, yeah. The last primary task that interpreters do is what I refer to as assessment. They're really assessing particular situations, what's occurring, who's involved, what the goals are for the situation. And during that assessment, they are instantly responding as quickly as they can, making decisions on the fly. Some of you may know that, of course, Robin Dean and Pollard's work talks about assess and respond. And that you will see occur a great deal in the K through 12 setting. It occurs with a moment by moment. So I'd like to summarize in saying that I found that interpreters do 5 tasks, the first being interpreting and transliterating. So just having a skill in one is not good enough. So the and being the key component there. The second is finding and utilizing a variety of resources. The third is becoming productive, becoming a productive employee. The fourth is interacting with others. And the fifth is assessing and responding. So deciding what to do. Interestingly, when I said that we are doing interpreting and transliterating, I was looking at 2 different situations. One situation in a library where I was counting the different decision points that were made by the interpreter. I had a total of 12 that I had counted. Only 1 was interpreting. The other 11 were other decisions. And interpreting programs typically do not address that. They don't teach that subject. How to make decisions in other situations, not just interpreting situations. And I didn't realize that was going on until the research that I had done, where we were looking at what interpreters actually do, what situations they're facing. We send them out and give them the bare minimum to try to survive in these interpreting situations. The fifth task, the assess and respond. That's what interpreters do. But that also led to my second question, which was why? And the why is key because when we think about the assessing, that will then influence future decisions. What to do in the moment, but then also what to do next. So you're assessing both what's occurring and why it's occurring. Because as the interpreter is assessing the situation, they may find that something has happened, which will then lead them to a decision to do something different. I found 3 broad themes in my research as far as what the interpreters were trying to do, what these 3 interpreters were trying to do in order to meet what they saw as large needs in the particular situations. And so I'm going to expand on each of these. Interpreters in my study were trying to provide access for the deaf and hard of hearing students. One of them being ensuring that the student could see whatever they needed to see. A second overarching motivation was to promote the learning of content as well as language. So it wasn't just sign language, but sign language and English, and sometimes not just English, but English and sign language. So to promote the learning of language overall. The third motivation was cultivating opportunities for the students to become involved, to participate. So those were the three motivations, or the three goals that interpreters were trying to achieve. They didn't always succeed in doing so. Sometimes they did very well. But in all situations, these were their main driving forces. I mentioned Dr. Winston's earlier work with the prediction that interpreters and students who are relying on interpreted instruction while being shown something else at the same time will then experience challenges. So that would be challenging for deaf and hard of hearing students to attend to both visual information as well as a sign language interpreter. Dr. Mark Marshark found that deaf graduate students were able to do so effectively. They were able to split their attention between visual information and the interpreter. But we don't know when that skill is developed. We think that's very interesting, but we don't know when that occurs. So how does an interpreter either assist or cause a disruption with that kind of visual access? Some people will say, well, deaf-blind students don't see, and I realize that maybe my terminology is not the best, but the point is that there is some visual stimulation, and that is critical. Or if there is visual stimulation, it is critical. Then how do we provide that access to the students? During my study, I wanted to look at how often and how long we had what I called competing visual demand, or demands. So it was, the long term was competing for the deaf and hard of hearing students' visual attention. And I was just wondering how often it occurred and how long it lasted. I have a sample of 10 hours, and almost 9 hours of that has something other than interpreting and teaching. It has something in addition to the interpreter and the teacher. It could be the interpreter, a teacher, and a worksheet, the interpreter and the teacher and the board, the interpreter and the teacher and some other element. And I found that 89% of the time, there is something in addition to the interpreter and the teacher that the deaf student has to attend to. So interpreters need to be aware of how to deal with those situations. And that was one of the first themes that I found that influenced interpreter decision-making. So during an interpreting situation, there are different options. One of them is physically moving, somehow walking, standing, leaning, ensuring that the student can see the interpreter as well as the other visual stimulus. Another key element of making sure that students are able to see is that the interpreter needs to see as well. And they need to keep in mind that hearing students need to be able to see, so they have to alter their position depending on what's going on in the classroom to ensure that everybody can see it. So you'll see that we've got the interpreter who's leaning over to see what the teacher is doing because they weren't able to see that visual stimulus. They were able to do that. And then the second picture here shows the interpreter looking at the hearing students to make sure that where she was standing was not blocking their visual access. I'll show the pictures again, and then I want to bring up the next slide. if you have competing visual demands, as I said, the interpreter may move. Another option is also to actually indicate to the student where they should look, either by pointing or touching, calling their attention, asking them to look in a certain direction, or looking at it themselves so that they can cause other students to look. For example, if everybody looks up at the ceiling, if one person looks up at the ceiling, then everybody else may look up at the ceiling as well. So that joint attention. The third strategy utilized by interpreters for optimizing visual access was that the interpreter will decide to either allow the deaf and hard of hearing students to first look at the visual stimulus and then hold the interpreted information until the student looks at them, or they will interpret as quickly as possible and then indicate where the student should look so that the student can look at that visual stimulus. And sometimes both occur. And another factor is that the student themselves might have their own approach or preferred method. Sometimes in one situation, they want the interpreter to sign, and then they see students looking elsewhere, and so they look elsewhere, and then the interpreter has to make adjustments according to that. It's a bit of a dance with when the student's looking at the interpreter, when the student's looking away from the interpreter, getting the student's attention, etc. It could be something that they find important to look at. Dr. Metzger and Dr. Fleetwood have talked about what they call source attribution, where you're saying the interpreter will add who said what, that type of information, and I found that here as well. One example of this was the teacher was talking about magma in volcanoes. And the teacher had said that first you have the slope and it looks like this. And then, he said, and then the magma starts to build within the volcano and the slope starts to look like this. So the interpreter looked at the teacher's gestures and then incorporated those gestures into her own interpretation. And that's what I meant by modify the interpretation itself. Incorporating or adding or adjusting in order to reduce the need for the student to have to look in two different locations at the same time.
The second overarching theme that I found was that interpreters are striving to facilitate the deaf and hard of hearing students' learning of both the content that was being taught and the language. One way in which they do this is through discourse and dialogue with the student. And this happens for several reasons. Remember, I mentioned earlier that interpreters are constantly interacting with others in a single work setting. So we are engaging what they already know and doing so to examine what they already know so we know best how to bring in the next, newest information. Interpreters sometimes are using examples from the lives of the students they're working with, based on what they know the student already knows. They will look for some experience that is already present in the deaf and hard of hearing student in order to hook the new knowledge onto. At times, the interpreter is also tutor. And that is an area of particular controversy, but I'll give some examples of this a little bit later. Interpreters are working to foster language development, English development, and American Sign Language development, and to create connections between the two for the student. This is a huge job. The third overarching theme was that of interpreters being motivated to serve the needs of the deaf and hard of hearing students. And an important one is the participation of those students. Their work shows that deaf and hard of hearing students who are mainstreamed are largely mainstreamed in isolation, or with very few other deaf and hard of hearing students in there with them. Dr. Olivia just wrote a second publication on specifically this, how deaf and hard of hearing students experience social isolation in these settings, as well as looking at the power and hype and the Ramsey also has looked at the findings that deaf and hard of hearing students are not socially engaged in the same way as other students. In addition, also looking at the action occurring in the classroom, how actively participatory the deaf and hard of hearing students are. Do they have the opportunity to answer? And what reasons would they perhaps have for not participating? How also the interpreter can foster that participation so that the deaf student can participate and be engaged in class more frequently and not be isolated in the environment. From time to time, the interpreter will cue the student that this is an opportunity to raise the hand so that they can be called upon and provide an answer and participate. The interpreter will sometimes cue the student for this, encouraging them to respond. But from time to time, we would also see that the same interpreter would not engage in that same action. And we wanted to examine how they determined whether they were going to concentrate on providing the interpretation, rendering it, or prompting the student to participate. What influenced those decision points? You can see sometimes interpreters are looking directly, not as a means of conveying teacher praise, but directly themselves praising student engagement and participation, giving that reinforcement. At times, allowing student participation means determining that one will not interpret in that moment. But we're certainly told that we're supposed to interpret everything that's happening at any given moment. The teacher's talking away, and yet the interpreter is not actively interpreting that moment. Indeed, this was something that we found an example of here in a student who was deaf and hard of hearing. Many of these students have their own identities, and we needn't necessarily attribute those identities to them. They can self-determine this. One example of this was a deaf and hard of hearing student who was engaged in work that was well ahead of where they were at in the larger classroom. The rest of the class might be on problem 2 or 3, and the deaf student is moving ahead at 8 on question number 8. And the interpreters are largely taught that they're supposed to be interpreting everything that's supposed to be happening at the same time. But the whole class is not all engaged together. The interpreter is trying to direct the student to question 2 or question 3 where the rest of the class is. The interpreter at times would simply continue signing in a half-hearted manner that indicated that there wasn't a need to necessarily be engaged on problem 2. The interpreter can be at a loss of what to do. There's a decision point at this point whether or not they should interpret the question into English that a deaf student had on problem 8 when the rest of the class was still engaged on problem 2. The interpreter would sometimes directly engage with the student on problem 8 rather than do so. Other influences on the interpreter's decision-making process would include praise, redirecting attention of the student to the teacher, and a number of factors came into play in determining which route to take. The interpreters are also trying to foster greater independence on the part of the deaf and hard of hearing students so that they have the full value of this educational experience. They're balancing multiple factors at any given time. And this also depends on the student's own readiness for that independence. The less experienced interpreter had 2 deaf and hard of hearing students in their classroom, one of whom was raised in a mainstream environment and another who was new to it, and one of whom had a signing background in the home with deaf parents, the other of whom was new to sign language and came from a Spanish-speaking family and was in 5th grade at this time. So during instructional time, when students were working individually on their own individual projects or their writing assignments, perhaps, we found that one of the young girls who was mainstreamed was able to speak for themselves but also able to sign, indicated to the interpreter that they needed to go to the restroom. And the interpreter told that student, "Go ahead, ask the teacher, that's fine." So the student was able to go up, address the teacher, and when the student signed they needed to go to the bathroom, the teacher simply handed them a pass and they went about their way. The teacher, not even knowing sign, knew the purpose of the query. But the same interpreter with the same teacher in the same classroom environment, when interpreting for the other young student, the young male, indicated, and this was something we actually elicited from the interview, not from the videotape itself. We were asking the interpreter why they changed their decision process in regard to the girl's question and the young boy's question. When the young man asked to go to the bathroom, the interpreter said, "Would you like me to come with you to the teacher to speak to him and ask for permission?" Because the interpreter recognized that the other student, who was newer to the environment, was not yet at the same level of readiness. And so there are competing decisions to be made on which course of action is in this case correct. We don't want to encourage reliance or dependency, but neither do we want to foster a sink or swim approach. Two of the interpreters that were involved in the study developed interesting strategies and techniques to foster the participation and involvement of the students. The teacher had some worksheets that the students were discussing, and if they were perhaps talking about question number 2, then it might be a very common experience for the interpreter to have to finish hearing the question of number 2, render it into sign language, and then by the time the deaf and hard of hearing student had seen the whole message, the opportunity to participate was lost. So if the teacher was, for example, working on problem 13, the interpreter might disregard the teacher's discussion of problem 13 and jump ahead to problem 14 so that the student could be engaged, participate, and readily be able to raise their hand, be called on by the teacher, and provide their own response to number 14 rather than concentrating on number 13, which instilled a great sense of pride and accomplishment in the student rather than they meekly, passively sitting there learning, while in fact missing wonderful opportunities to participate in the class if we do not address these inequities in participation and opportunities for participation, who will? Whether it be for the social purposes of that participation or the academic sense of belonging and participation as in the group. So this really begs further research. I find it to be an area of critical importance, especially as a mother of a deaf son. I have instructed directly those interpreters working with my son and my son's school on some of these strategies. If they are, on the bus, for example, with the student, then their job actually begins prior to ever entering into the classroom. My son just last week was asking him about what the interpreter does for my son and what the most important part of his day is with the interpreter, and it's lunch. Lunch was his reply, because there is the opportunity to interact with other students in a social environment, and to do so with only a single interpreter is quite difficult. If we look back at our own social experiences in school, those were powerful. A single interpreter cannot possibly engage in all of the needed work in both the social environments of lunchroom, classroom, recess, outside of class environments, and the classroom work itself. They're engaged with hearing people who don't really know how to interact with deaf people. And in my own experience, having a deaf son who would perhaps go to McDonald's, and now I'm not here to be a big sponsor of McDonald's, but they have a wonderful play area that our family likes. We love play areas, and so my son has always enjoyed going there and will avidly play with the other students, but many of the other kids in the play areas will be at a loss for how to deal with him. They'll say, well, can't he talk? And I'll have to prompt them about signing or gesturing, and I'll give them some cues on how to do so. And once they do, teach them a couple of basic gestures, then the game is afoot. They are playing for hours at that point. They can do so quite easily. They simply need somebody to help mediate that moment. Rather than leaving them all in isolation, we want to encourage this kind of interaction, and it's not difficult to do so, but we must explicitly instruct people on how to do so. We're seen as the expert in this area, and in fact, we are. We have that to be able to explicitly instruct others so that they can consider how they can interact, and we can foster that. This doesn't happen only in the academic environment, but deaf and hard of hearing students are absolutely going to feel isolated when they don't have access to communication with each other in these social times. During the elicitation interviews, I asked the interpreters about their English renderings and when it was either directly rendered or prompting the student to raise their hand so that they could participate. What went into those processes? And many of them struggled to be able to articulate what was in that, and unpacking that decision-making process was very difficult. For many of them, they were sometimes ambivalent about why they'd chosen one course over another. But one of the reasons that I found quite striking for their decision-making processes was in checking with the interpreter would, from time to time, who would give an answer themselves, and that was because a response from the student was not intended for public consumption, and having voiced that would have been seen as a betrayal of the trust given to the interpreter by the student. And if they were unsure, and what they could then indicate to the student their query about whether or not that was for public consumption. But once spoken, it cannot be undone and is already seen as a betrayal of the trust given to them by the student, and so the opportunity for building that trust was lost. And another example of this is that an interpreter working with a student who is not engaging or communicating with other students in the class. And so very often the interpreter could check in with them. They might see that the deaf student is having to interact with other students, checking in with the interpreter or other students. Where's the opportunity for private discourse that doesn't interrupt the teacher, so that in every instance when they need clarification, they're interrupting the teacher. They needed opportunities to be able to access that information in other ways. Okay. It may be difficult to see the text on the screen. Sorry, now that I'm seeing it on the large screen, I can see it might be difficult to see. This was a particular lesson on suffixes. The teacher had asked students to provide words that used the suffix ward, W-A-R-D, such as to go toward, or a reward. The deaf student looked at the interpreter and used and said to the interpreter in a way that was clearly indicated to be only communicated to the interpreter, be warned, and seeing if that was. So be warned, and asked whether or not that was an appropriate example of this kind of suffix. And so this was a very brief interaction between the interpreter and the student, in which the interpreter sees that the child is thinking about language development and saw that the student doesn't have access to hearing the English, and so in an attempt to foster that in a safe and private, respectful way, that the student was able to ask the interpreter whether or not this was an appropriate example, and in honoring that respect, not betraying it by making this for public consumption, they were able to just very surreptitiously indicate that that was an appropriate example of that particular suffix. So the interpreter later saw, when the student gave a different example that was appropriate, was able to very tacitly give an indication that this was an appropriate one, so the student was able to engage and participate publicly with that second example. This is quite striking. This means that the interpreter must know pedagogy. They must know teaching. This is in itself pedagogy. We cannot leave them to figure out independently, on their own, individually, all of this on their own. But we're not teaching these students pedagogy. We must be thinking about students that are dual language learners and what pedagogy looks like in this setting. So this is not only that of dual language learners, but also dual language learners who are also coming into the education environment with language deficiencies, who don't have a strong language base. We say very often that 90 to 95% of deaf youth come from families wherein the parents are hearing and don't know sign. Having a deaf child, they have, at best, very minimal learning of sign language. Many of them are trying to learn the language at the same time that they're rearing their child, and they are not serving as effective language models in the home. And so interpreters are often told that they're not language models. Well, says who? You know, and so if then if the interpreters aren't a good language model, then I'm so sorry, kid, you're not really getting any good language model. But the interpreters in these schools, for good or ill, are language models. We need to be ensuring that we're bringing qualified interpreters as these language models. And if we're not, then how can we possibly wonder why these students aren't developing language on these normal patterns? So I think I'm sensing a pattern here. Not only that of language, but also there's another study by Hopper, I believe it is, who was looking at incidental learning. I believe this is the 2011 work from Hopper. Dr. Kurz also mentions that there is some great literature review to be seen in that. I saw the presentation back in October. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth it. But in the research, they talk about the exposure to incidental learning and how critical that is, comparing hearing students and deaf students' exposure to incidental learning, and the difference was quite striking. The amount of exposure given to the hearing students was profoundly more than that of the deaf students. There's a profound deficiency here in the opportunity to learn from random exposure to incidental knowledge. And then if we are then bringing in an interpreter who doesn't have any knowledge or pedagogy of how to bring in that incidental knowledge, then we certainly cannot be wondering about how that student could possibly be so deprived or behind.
I'm a bit heartbroken myself because right now, interpreter education and interpreter educators and interpreter organizations are realizing that most interpreting programs, associates programs, are what most of them are, and they are by far a preponderance of associate degree programs as opposed to four-year programs like ours. When our students go through a four-year program, they get a 2-year degree, and they're told, you're not ready yet, good luck. And that's not sufficient. That's not adequate for our students. They're often working within a year after graduation, and they're able to pass the EIPA with a 4.0, which is great. But then they can proceed after that. And it's a bit ironic, because in my study, I wanted to know more about how I can better prepare the students, but I don't have time, even though we have a 2-year program that requires 4 years of study. How am I supposed to teach all of that material, language as well as the other components, addressing different scenarios, talking about legal, video interpreting, mental health interpreting, medical interpreting? And people are asking me, why don't you teach your students? And I would love to, but I don't have the time. So we're fighting for more 4-year programs, and unfortunately, 4 years is still not enough for language development itself. And you're talking about language transliteration and interpreting programs. Spoken language interpreting programs have already known about this for years. They require a bachelor's degree as well as 2 years of living in another country in order to develop proficiency in that language. And then they're able to go into the field of transliterating and interpreting and to enter those programs, translating programs. We're fighting for something, and what we're fighting for is still not enough. But we're fighting because it's better than what we have now. The question is, what do we do? There's also that concept of, it's not my role. Oh, well, as the interpreter, you're a school interpreter, you're doing too much, you're causing the students to rely on you. And we need to stop making those kinds of arguments. Those of you who are working as professional certified interpreters and those who are working in educational systems are colleagues. Those who are in educational such settings are qualified or not qualified, and we need to address them as colleagues, and we need to help them foster their skills and help them to meet the levels that they need to meet in order to bring them into the field of interpreting as a whole. So how do we help to lift them up? I've seen more and more community interpreters who are certified interpreters who don't know all this material either. They haven't talked about how to put this in practice. And I think that what would be beneficial is more in-depth training for certified interpreters about the school system. These people are working with kids who don't even have language yet. So give them all the tools that we can. And share the tools that we have in interpreting as a whole. It's not just about doing something. It's
Something is unjust.
if something is unjust, we need to do something, and it's time to do so. In 2007, the Presidential Education Report said the superintendent of the Department of Education said that 85% of hard of hearing students and 92% of deaf students are passing the language arts exams at proficient or above. That was the goal for California. They wanted all students to pass at proficient or above. There are different levels. Basic is the third level. But only 8% of deaf students and 15% of hard of hearing students were able to meet that goal. And that's not just. We need to do something. I have to move along quickly because time is running short. Now, as I said, we're in a crisis situation. This is an emergency. We need to change. I think at the national level, it is time for a task force to be established with individuals, perhaps parents, to require an EIPA score of 4.0 or an RID certification, NIC certification, NADRIT certification, RID certification. And we need to have interpreters committing themselves to growing more, and we need to have administrators who can figure out how to pay equitably for the skilled interpreters that we need. So we need to figure out how we can continue to fight for graduate level education. But we need more organizations, for example, the National Association for the Deaf, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, the Department of Education. It's time for everybody to take a look at this and to change what has been going on. I'm sure there's more, but think about what you as an individual can do. Oh, deaf organizations as well. Deaf clubs. We talk about how hearing students need exposure to more advanced language use in deaf clubs and where the deaf heart is. Oftentimes, when I try to approach deaf schools or deaf individuals, they say it's great, but deaf teachers say, well, you know, I think we're relying on deaf people too much. Maybe we can do that a little bit later. And I'm still waiting for somebody to become involved. I've approached training, you know, I ask you to approach training programs near you and say that you would like to have one, two, or three interns if you're deaf. Write a letter. Send it off to a legislator. These are different activities that you can do. I apologize. I didn't leave much time for question and answer. I don't know if we have time for question and answer, do we?
We do, for a few.
Dr. Metzger is actually coming to the stage right now. Looks like she's going to ask a question.
First of all, thank you so much. I found this very enjoyable, as I did reading your book, and critical work. Very important. Even with its importance, it is only the merest beginning, just scratching the surface. It begs so many questions, but among those, I'll select one to ask you. I'd like to ask your thoughts on these findings and in comparing the deaf and hard of hearing student with the interpreter and the one-to-one relationship between them. I am working with children in the classroom here. I'm often working with 4, 5, and 6 deaf students at the same time and not one-to-one ratio here. And so you bring up a number of questions about how we can work to foster visual attention, deal with competing challenges, and not so simple as knowing their orientation in which to assign 1 + 1 = 2. There are a number of individual students as well as competing visual stimuli. What do you think about the import of your work with multiple students?
How to train and prepare for that, you mean?
Well, perhaps more about the findings themselves, the implications. I'm sorry, perhaps my question isn't as clear as it could be. But perhaps it's a two-part question. The first part being that about research itself and the continuation of this research. Secondly, I'd also like to ask about the interest in how we can improve our preparation of these students in this way. I'm sorry, not the smallest question I could have asked.
So for training, yes, we do need to talk about that. But when it comes to research, there are so many areas in which we can delve. I think it's a wide open area for research. So just pick something and seek it out. One thing you could look at is interaction. What kind of interaction takes place? Another is what works. What are the characteristics of an interpreter who is able to negotiate well, advocate well, ask for what they need or what the student needs, work with the teacher? Because there's not just one way to do so. Also, how interpreters approach resistance. How do they deal with those situations? That could be just one part that can be looked at in more detail. The qualifications that we have right now are not enough. We have experienced interpreters who talk about how we're going to deal with when students are taking turns reading, when the deaf student can't read the book at the same time that they're watching the interpreter. And then you're talking about reading level issues. So what to do in those situations. It's also important for those deaf and hard of hearing students to be able to participate. So these are areas in which we definitely need to look into. We have another question? Last question.
Hello there, hello. So, one of my big concerns with educational interpreting is that of how we will ever get sufficient compensation for this when that standards are being steadily weakened and requirements are. So, if we are looking at interpreters who are accepting other roles in addition to that of interpreting, like aid, teacher's aid, or classroom aid, well, we're interpreting. The teacher is engaged in teaching, and then the interpreter is both trying to be aid and interpreter at the same time. How can we foster professional recognition of educational interpreters when we have this muddied water of our roles as interpreters as well as these other roles?
Thank you for your question. I found it very interesting that you said that we're lowering our standards, because from my perspective, I think we want to raise our standards. And we are raising our standards. And we need to recognize that we need to address the language that's taking place, the learning that's taking place. We need to become more like teachers, or at least know that information, or we're not going to be effective interpreters in the education setting. And some people say, well, there are some aid duties. I don't have time to explain this in details, but some of those aid duties are actually very efficient for making, for one example, an interpreter made a poster with different signs on it and posted it on the wall. A teacher had asked the interpreter to do so with the different signs so that the hearing students would be able to learn some signs. And frankly, that would be considered a duty for a paraprofessional in aid. Or to distribute papers in the classroom. While the students are working, maybe have some interactions with some of the other students in the classroom, develop rapport with the other students in the classroom. So what's key to me is the what, the when, and the how we talk about those so that the teacher is aware. We have to make sure that these activities that we're doing don't conflict with our primary responsibility as an interpreter. It could become a problem, but oftentimes it's not a problem. It's not an issue. And so oftentimes the interpreter is just sitting there and there's nothing to prepare for the next, rather than preparing for the next event that's taking place.
Well,
We're all a team, so maybe the teacher can share lesson plans with us so that we can prepare. We need to keep that in mind.
Well, I do apologize that we have to cut short this wonderful discussion. But one thing I'd like to say before closing is that I recognize that young man right there. This is actually Melissa's son, who you see on this screen, in his younger days. I've had a few opportunities to see him in other pictures of your son, so I recognize him. Thanks for including your family for us in your presentation. Thank you so much for coming here to Gallaudet, sharing your thoughts, sharing your work and your passion for this topic. We certainly feel the same, and we actually have a small token of our appreciation I'd like to give you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank
all
you.
of you for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you very much, and I wanted to thank UCSD, the faculty, again, for their support of my research.